If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week and every week on Biblical Anarchy, we seek to live counterculture to the empire of man and to instead seek the kingdom of God by unpacking what the Bible teaches about government, authority, and human relationships. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. For today's episode, I'm going to present to you a clip from a recent live stream that I did with esteemed economist and libertarian theorist Bob Murphy. For those of you who might not be familiar with Bob Murphy, let me give you a brief introduction. Also, before I get into it, please make sure that you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, or if you are on Apple or Spotify, please leave a 5-star review, a written review if you can. That helps us out a lot and helps this message reach more people. So Bob Murphy is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He's also author of several books, including Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, which is an accessible introduction into Ludwig von Mises and sort of the Austrian school and sort of Mises's economic theories. He's also written the book, or kind of like pamphlet, Chaos Theory, which is 2 essays on market anarchy and private law, then the private production of defense. And he is the host of the Bob Murphy Show, which I have been on, and also the Human Action podcast for the Mises Institute. So I had Bob on and we had like a 2-hour live stream. So I'm only going to be sharing with you a small section from that. If you want to then listen to the entire conversation, the link for that will be in the description. Bob is a fellow Christian as well, and someone who I have learned a lot from since I became more libertarian-leaning in my political and economic views. As I often talk about on this show, I lead with my Christianity, and I often am making the case for peace and cooperation and things that libertarians value from the biblical worldview. And Bob will also do that, but he's primarily an economist. And so he specializes in the study of what Austrians call human action. So he looks at also at how markets work, things like how price controls lead to the problem of economic calculation, things how government intervention in the economy and the Federal Reserve changing interest rates, how Austrians are better able to track and predict how the market's going to respond to certain things than your traditional Keynesian economists will. For a while, Bob had a show called Contra Krugman, where he would debunk the economic fallacies of Paul Krugman. So Bob, I had on the show to have a conversation about the criticisms that conservatives make about libertarians. And this was sort of off the heels of the debates that Dave Smith and I have done against Andrew Wilson and a lot of the Christian populists, Christian nationalists. And, they tend to think that the problem with libertarianism is that unless you have a central power, that not only will you have things like degeneracy, because libertarianism would say that if it's not aggression, that we can't use force to stop it, but also they would have a concern that without a central power to sort of break up monopolies and the corruption of private institutions, that this leads to not only social and cultural decay and degeneracy, but that it's going to lead to these private institutions getting so much power that they essentially become governments themselves or make new governments. And so this gets into a lot of libertarian theory in the entire 2-hour conversation we have, which I haven't done too many episodes about on my podcast, on the Biblical Anarchy podcast. I'd like to do more. The the school of Austrian thought and sort of the critique of anarcho-capitalism and libertarianism, I often am arguing from a moral framework, from like a deontological framework. But then it's always fair to ask, well, okay, if we remove the state, how would things work? And Bob is one of those people who does a very good job at explaining how we can have governance and we can have law and we can have resolution of conflict and the upholding of property rights in a society that governs without the state. And so a lot of we get into is in the specifics of licensing, because that's one of the criticisms that came up in the debate between Andrew and Dave. And so we get into how licensing and sort of regulations of a sort could exist and be applied in a truly free market without state interference, and why this would not be subject to the criticisms that Andrew and others levy, and also why it would work better than a state licensing system. So I'm going to go ahead and let you listen to this clip, and I'll see you on the other side.
For example, I'll just do this one anecdote. I know we got to keep moving through the material. My dad's friend was a purchasing manager for Kodak a long time ago, and he would go to Japan a lot, and he would just tell me about it, and he would say, hey, over there, I don't know if this is still true, but probably relatively true, that like the vending machines, you could just stick your hand in and take stuff. Like, whereas in the US they're designed so you know what I mean, you can't, like the way the metal flap goes. And because it would be unheard of. No one would do it. And he said the bikes weren't locked up. And I asked a guy, well, what happens if somebody took somebody's bike and started riding it away? And he said, well, a crowd would chase him down and beat him. He was just like mystified at the question. So I think with a lot of these things too, the kind of society where everybody is cool, like just takes it as a given that, oh yeah, if you got caught shoplifting, you're going to get 30 lashes in the public square. Or, if you disrespect your parents, you're in serious trouble legally and whatever. Or, you're a young woman who's sleeping around and you're not married. That's, you go to spend the night in jail or whatever, making stuff up. The kind of society that's like that, there's probably, if those weren't technically illegal and there were just very strong social ostracism mechanisms, that would probably be pretty effective too. You get what I mean? So it's I think there's that interplay that you got to kind of keep the culture constant and then just add or take away the government enforcement. And that's really the issue. Like the reason that stuff is legal here is because people are okay with it. And that's why it's happening. It's not merely they legalize it and the floodgates open.
Right. And it's also kind of like a matter of trade-offs and going like, well, if you have a government that's that strong and powerful to just really easily crack down on those things, what's the, like in the same way he's going to criticize the private institutions and why won't they do this? It's like, okay, well, what's your solution for stopping the government that has the totalitarian power to perfectly stop all this degeneracy from just like, okay, now we're going to, tax you at 40% and we're going to, shut churches down and whatnot. It's like, it's nice to kind of just perfectly conceive that, the government will just, only do the stuff we like, but then you can just go, all right, in my system, the private institutions just only do the stuff I like. It's like, that's not in either case, we don't, it's like, you can do that, or you can engage, and I think what's a better faith debate in terms of like, well, what are the incentives and what are the trade-offs of both of these systems, and let's play those out over the long run and keep the culture constant. Because obviously, like, I think you would agree, you can imagine a rather large government, but with a very moral people, that might be better to live in than in a society where maybe there's not much government, but it's like a really evil, people. So like, we're not saying that small government always just leads to the best outcomes, but it's always compared to what.
Right. Like the the example I would use is that in Canada, they have a very big government, but the people there are very, on average, friendly and amicable and so on. And so it doesn't feel as oppressive. But one time we were taking a family trip, through Niagara Falls, and the customs agent we got, had the Canadian system. A guy was from like the Bronx or something. Like he was clearly American. And I was like, ooh, that's the worst combination. That, in other words, it can work where you have limited government and then people who can be kind of gruff because they're okay, fine. Or you can have, really oppressive government, but the people administering it are very friendly and chipper and helpful. But what doesn't work is when you get the real gruff person who doesn't care whether, you have a nice day or not, and he's got all this power to ruin your family trip if he wants to.
Sorry, I forgot to have my mouse ready to unmute. I think that makes perfect sense. So kind of alluded to this already, but we're going to expand on this a bit. Andrew Dave was kind of saying, well, the government causes all these issues because of lobbying, because power becomes for sale, and then people, lobby to the government to pick winners and losers, and this creates this, negative centralization of power that works against sort of the things that we would value as Christians. But Andrew's objection was that private institutions are just as susceptible to this, both logically and historically. The idea of the question he asked Dave was like, should transgenderism should trans surgeries be allowed? And Dave was like, obviously, for children, no. For adults, well, I guess kind of yes, but like a doctor should lose their license. And then Andrew like, well, but it's voluntary. He's like, well, a license could be, a licensing board could be voluntary.
Yeah.
And then Andrew's like, well, how do you know though? Like, if you can lobby the government license system to go a certain way, why can't that go bad in the private sector as well? Because he kind of said the AMA basically started out as like a private entity. So what would your response be to that? I know we kind of touched on that briefly already, that like, well, yeah, it can go bad, but like, what are the arguments for why we could, have at least some confidence to go, well, it doesn't necessarily have to go bad in the same way that we know it goes bad in the statist paradigm?
Sure. So yeah, obviously we could go a whole episode just on this one topic. So I'll just try to be brief. I mean, everything you said and what, Dave's rebuttals were, I think is correct. I agree with. And just to elaborate a bit, the primary thing that you've got when you have it being held in the private sector is that there's competition, right? That it's not just a given that one agency has to be there. So there could be competing licensing agencies, right? And all that would mean is that, they're like certification boards might be a better way of saying it, as opposed to and hey, you're allowed to go get brain surgery from anybody, but probably most people are going to say, well, where'd you go to school? Like, we know that there's these reputable certification agencies, or the local hospital is only going to hire a brain surgeon who's gone to medical school and done their internship and blah, blah, blah. And, so, there's all those vetting procedures in place. And then, you can say, well, what if, some diabolical person, we really wanted to just do something horrible for no good reason. Okay. And then that certification board would have that mark against them, and, they would quickly lose favor with the public, and people would realize, no, those people vouch for doctors that are quacks. So the fact that you're certified by them means nothing to me now, because I've just, read 3 high profile cases in the newspapers about you guys signing off on somebody who was a butcher. Okay. So there's that. Whereas right now, if the AMA, I should say that if the state licensing board that, in conjunction with the AMA and whatever, if they're giving somebody their license and the guy shouldn't have his license, what are you going to do? You can't just switch over. You know what I mean? It's illegal for someone who's not licensed to practice medicine. So it's not like you can take your business elsewhere. You're not allowed to. And then you can say, oh, but surely they're going to get in trouble. What, when you go vote for governor, your vote's going to depend on that. And what if the 2 candidates agree on the license? You know what I mean? So there's a lot less options, or a lot fewer options you have,
right,
as a consumer to react. Whereas again, if it's a decentralized, and that's the thing too, is that the state right now bundles all these different questions into like a few discrete choices that you have as a voter.
Well, and then it's also
citizen.
Forced on it's the same rules apply everywhere. Whereas in a decentralized system, sure, maybe there's some areas of society where that is how it works, but then there can at least be some areas where that's not how it works, right? As opposed to a one-size solution for all. And then, then you can even work to try to change things in other parts of society. you wouldn't say, okay, we're going to raise an army and go invade and conquer them and change it that way, but you would try to, use market mechanisms of, like education, boycotts, et cetera, advertising, things like that, to try to encourage people to, further incentivize what you like and disincentivize what you don't like. Again, it does kind of depend somewhat on a moral people who have the right values and espousing those values, trying to educate those values, which I think starts in the family and works out through the community, and the church plays a role in that. So like, and you have to do that no matter what. It's just like, is the deck more stacked against that process if you live in our current society, which kind of, through fiat institutes one system for the entire country, or a decentralized system where you can have more competition? I think it's a lot easier to advocate for those changes and secure them through the decentralized model.
And I think just, having worked in the private sector for, organizations of varying sizes, I think it's true that like even a giant company, like I worked at Kodak as a summer job, and and I would hear stories that like, oh yeah, back in the the early '80s when we were so dominant and ran Rochester, the city, there was all kinds of stuff. Like guys would go out drinking at lunchtime, but then when the Japanese started competing, like we really had to get serious. You know what I mean? So there's things like that too, where it's the threat of competition that makes the the internal company do things that like they weren't probably behaving the way I would have taught to my Econ 201 students before. But there ultimately was that check that, if you guys are too lazy and too complacent, you're going to lose market share. And, so eventually the shareholders are going to bring a different CEO to get serious and start cracking down and, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So related to this, they then started talking more about like history and sort of the role of NGOs and the private influence on sort of growing the sort of government that we have today. Because that was like Andrew's response to that. Like, he was like, well, the private institutions lobbied the government and grew the government the way it is. And so private institutions are, part of the problem, maybe a source of the problem. And so he's kind of making the argument that you hear, surprisingly, a lot of normies make, because it's what they're taught in school, is like, well, we need a balance, right? Like if you have a total free market, that's bad because businesses can run amok. And if you have a total government control, well, that's a problem. And so they kind of make the checks and balances argument, right? Where it's like, well, you need, somewhat of some power in the market and some power in government, and they kind of clash and round each other out so that neither one can dominate the other. And so he's kind of in favor of antitrust and things like that. That kind of carried over from the end of their first debate into then their second conversation. So what are your thoughts on that? And also kind of like in terms of the history, which I know maybe is not your primary field of expertise. I'm sure some of they were talking about like Carnegie and Rockefeller and all that, and like they were like, well, it was these industrialists who started lobbying for more regulation and more control in government in the economy, and they like we bring these things up to go like, well, look, this is the problem with government. They lobby power to pick winners and losers. But then he was like, well, but that's the problem with, you're always going to have some kind of governing force, and they're just always going to, rich industrialists will always lobby it to go their way. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, big picture, I'm agreeing with you that I think with that countervailing power stuff, that's a bit like saying, oh, Luke and Leia and Han Solo should have built a Death Star to contain the Emperor and Darth Vader. And it's like, no, that if there's going to be a Death Star, the Emperor is going to be in charge of it. Like that's silly. So, that it's given that there's these giant corporations and, a few rich people that are behind them and running them, the last thing in the world you want to do is to create a more powerful state, because they are going to hijack that and they are going to use it against, the people. That's going to happen. Now, depending on the culture and the mores and the whatever, the politics, maybe that looks different in different societies or whatever, but in the long run, no, it's the average person without much influence or whatever is not going to be helped by a powerful machinery of state. That's just extremely naive to think that's what the outcome's going to be. And so, I would say that. The other thing too, I meant to say earlier and I forgot, there's a qualitative difference. It's not just decentralization and competition, like with, the AMA working in league with state medical licensing boards versus private certification. It's not just, a matter of degree or something, but also just qualitatively, when a private company is doing something, like people don't give it this sacrosanct status. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, like they know. So that's like when people say, oh, wouldn't the mafia just take over? I mean, I don't think so. And I can give you all the reasons why. But beyond that, one of the reasons they wouldn't is because everyone would just know
it's the
those are
mafia.
criminals. You know what I mean? Like, maybe we're paying the protection money because we don't want to get, whacked. But we understand we're being robbed. Whereas, even though libertarian, like I like to say taxation is theft, but I'm saying that to try to change people's minds, to get them to think about it, because most people do not think it is theft, at least not in the same way that, Tony Soprano is stealing from the local business owner that he's getting protection money from.
Yeah, I mean, isn't there also just like it's hard for me to imagine, and I guess I know there's probably examples of private institutions kind of printing their own monies and things like that, but like, again, in the same way that people would sort of like, with the government, when the government prints currency, they're like, oh, this is the currency, we have to use it. If like McDonald's printed, McDollars, right? Like maybe they would have some value, right? And people might collect them, but they wouldn't be like, well, I have to only use McDollars now, right? Like it's just, there wouldn't be that inherent belief that this is the only currency we're allowed to use. There's not, and that there can't be a competition there. And same with the other things that differentiate government from business. I mean, with government, if the government is providing a service, it's generally not allowing a competition. And so people are just like, well, I have to use this service. Whereas with businesses, like even there's not a lot of options in an area, like, you can still typically opt out of something. Like people don't inherently go like, well, maybe there's only like one fast food joint in my area. It's like, well, I don't have to go there. Right. Like I'm not, it's not, even if there's like geographic limitations, it's not like, well, gosh, I guess we're having McDonald's every day the rest of our life now for dinner.
Right. And even just to extend that, like a point I like to make on this stuff is to say that, it's the lack of competition that enforces the bad service that, right now when the police clearly use excessive force, some lady's handcuffed on the ground, they're kicking her in the head or something, people are catching on their phone. You will always see when that's making it around social media, people chiming in and saying, oh, you don't like the cops? Okay, well, next time someone's breaking into your house, what are you going to do? Call a plumber? Okay, but like you said, even if there's only one McDonald's, and if someone goes there and gets food poisoning, if he's complaining about, or, he posts a photo on Twitter showing, bugs crawling out of his Big Mac, people don't say, oh, well, I guess next time you're hungry, you're going to go eat something from the laundromat. They could say, hey, why'd they do that? You know what I mean? Because it's not this presumption that, well, if there's going to be food, it comes from the food company. Just like if there's going to be police services, it comes from the cops,
Right, exactly. Yes, I think that's an important distinction. And sure, like you said earlier, maybe, because Andrew's other argument was sort of that, well, they can band together and form a government, even if you don't have one. It's like, okay, maybe. And you kind of conceded that earlier, like, yeah, maybe that kind of happens. But it doesn't then follow that, the best solution for that is to just beat them to the punch and form a government.
Right.
And, it's like, just because something might go, it's kind of like me saying my engine might break, so therefore I'm going to, preemptively break it. Like,
right. Or like Batman tries to kill Superman because he might turn evil,
Right, exactly. It just doesn't, at that point, at the very least, I think what I said earlier follows, that it's the statist who's trying to be the utopian, not the libertarian. The libertarian's like, well, it might go wrong, but we're going to do our best to prevent it. Whereas the statists are like, well, it might go wrong, so we need to, force the right outcome at all times. And we just, I mean, like, I don't like, I think Andrew, I've heard him, not in that debate, but I've heard him say he understands and agrees mostly with Austrian economics. And I'm always puzzled, and I'm curious your thoughts, because I know working for the Mises Institute, you interact with some who are more on the paleocon side, who would agree with like Austrian economics, but aren't libertarians. I'm always a little bit I don't know, confused by that, because to me it's like if you understand the problem of economic calculation, then I don't know how you can reject central planning for the economy, but then just say, well, but you need it for law and government, and it wouldn't be subject to the same problems.
Right.
So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. It's always puzzled me.
Yeah. So I think it's easier to see for like private defense, right? So in my pamphlet Chaos Theory, I explicitly used a calculation argument in the second essay of that, which was, private military defense. That once, cause it's hard just to conceptually like, well, how would that even work? How would you fund it? And so I said, oh, well, there could be insurance companies. And then, just like the insurance company might pay you or give you a discount if you install smoke alarms and, fire extinguishers, but also they use the premiums to, have a deal with the local fire department or whatever, that makes it. Likewise, they could use the premiums to fund, service to air missiles and blah, blah, blah. And there, like, once you see how it's conceivable, there could be market forces at play, then, the calculation argument is obvious. It just jumps right out at you once you can see it. It's a little trickier. I still think it's valid, but I understand I can be more forgiving about how somebody might say, how would you even, like, without property titles being defined, how would you even know, what the costs and benefits were, or the revenues and the costs?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's wrong. Like, you can go through and explain it, but I can see how law and order itself is a little bit tricky just to go right to the calculation argument.
I guess I see that. I just think they would have to also concede that if they're not advocating for a global government, then they're just being arbitrary with, well, I guess we just by fiat have to say some government of some size has to exist with monopoly in some area. And, you just have to
keep
pick
in mind, Mises, who gave us all these arguments, was not an anarchist.
Right,
so,
I know.
Like, it's not just Andrew. It's like even Luke von Mises.
Oh, I know,
didn't see it. What's his deal? Idiot.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I guess I don't want to look down on them and say they're idiots. I guess I just take the view that Rothbard and those came after Mises just took those ideas and developed them. And so I can understand, like, before people make advances in science, you don't fault the people before them
enough.
for not.
Okay.
But it's like, now that we've made that development, there's some people who I think are really into, like, I remember going to a Mises Institute event and talking with Paul Gottfried, who I think is, incredibly intelligent, well-spoken. And I just, I just don't understand how people like him, as smart as they are, don't see that. Even if you can, have reasonable, okay, how does this work? Can you at least concede that, like, there's a, like, maybe there's a problem with, well, how would this work without the state? But can you at least admit, well, there is a problem with the state, which is it has to overcome these issues of economic calculation, even if you think they're necessary.
I think I can give you a plausible. So I'm not serious, like, speaking on behalf of Paul Gottfried specifically, but I think I can see that. So let me just be honest with you and the listeners. I was astonished, right? After the lockdowns were imposed, and, like, remember how there was a period there where you couldn't get toilet paper, and there was a really long period where you couldn't get, like, the Clorox wipes. Like, I had used those; that was my go-to thing, and, like, you just couldn't get it. And I don't mean like for 8 weeks; I mean for like a year. The Clorox wipes were just not available. I was like, what? So that really shook me in terms of what I thought private business could do based on changed characteristics. I was surprised, and I know there's all kinds of government. I get it, but I'm still saying, given what happened, I'm just being honest. I was surprised at how long it took them to retool and to, get toilet paper production back up and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And so now, don't get me wrong. I was also amazed at how horrible the government was. Like, in other words, I was naive on both fronts. Like, wow, private business isn't as good as I thought, and government's also worse than I thought.
Yeah.
And so it still doesn't, hurt my faith in libertarianism or whatever you want to call it. But I am just saying, I think there could be, like, wizened, guys on the right who've seen a lot of stuff and whatever, and know the nature of man, and just, like, read some tenured college academic writing up his thing about, and the most profitable outcome would be this. Like, if they listen to, like, a Brian Kaplan and just thinking, you don't know anything about the world, man. Like, it would not go that way.
I guess that, that reaffirms what I've always said, which is the biggest argument against libertarianism is libertarians. But
There's a similar thing with Christianity.
Well, yeah, unfortunately. Although the same argument holds to both, which is like, you know what? Like, what am I going to call myself? Jesus and like, I mean, like I don't like, I don't like the association with bad libertarians or bad Christians, but that just means all the more that the good, well-read libertarians and good, well-read Christians need to do a better job of, I don't know,
all seven of you
cleaning our rooms. Yeah.
Notice I didn't say us. I said you.
Right.
See,
yeah.
Being humble.
All right. Well, that is all I have for you today. I hope you found this enlightening. Again, Bob's insights, I think, highlight the potential for market-based solutions to address these complex societal problems that always exist in society, whether we have a state or not. We're never going to have utopia, but we're just trying to find what system of organization and what sort of moral norms for governance are going to give us the best outcomes, and also, as I always argue, what is most in keeping with Christian ethics and biblical principles. So thank you for joining us on this episode of the Biblical Anarchy podcast. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions where we explore the intersections of faith, freedom, and society. Until next time, seek the kingdom of God, live counterculture to the empire of man, live at peace, live for Christ. God bless.
The Biblical Anarchy podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.